This is the first album that changed my life, Mellon Collie and the Infinite Sadness by the Smashing Pumpkins. And I think that you should know why it's such an important album, not just to me, but to the history of rock music. So I was, I think, 11 years old when I first came across this album. I had heard the song 1979. I think I had seen the music video on MTV, and it was a really cool video. You know, they're driving around in the car, and Billy Corgan's singing in the back seat, and they're all just having fun. And it has this really kind of nostalgic feel. And I don't know that I would have understood that when I was 11, maybe 12 years old, but I just thought it was a really cool song. And eventually I went on to hear a couple of the other singles, Bullet with Butterfly Wings and, of course, Tonight Tonight. Listening to these songs by the Smashing Pumpkins was the first time that I realized this is for me. My dad was big into music and raised me on music, but up until that point, I kind of had always just listened to my dad's music, right? This is something that I connect with, and I need this album. So I did what most 11 or 12-year-olds would do. I started mowing some lawns, and eventually I saved up enough. And it was kind of a pain because it was a double disc, right? It's 2 discs, so it's extra expensive. I don't know if it was twice the price, but it was a bit more expensive. So I mowed a bunch of lawns and eventually saved up enough money to go get it. And I remember, my parents taking me to the mall and going into Sam Goody and buying it and going back to the car. And I remember opening the packaging in the back seat of the car and, pulling out the liner notes and starting to read through it. And I remember getting home and I popped it into the CD changer in the stereo in the basement. And I just went on this 2-hour journey through this album. I mean, I just sat there dumbfounded through the whole thing. My exposure to music had been my dad's classic rock and popular music on the radio. And then I get hit in the face with Jelly Belly and Zero. And I see the depths of possibility within music. I see the ambition and the emotion and the range of sound that was achievable by a band. This album was the first to really show me that music could be a form of art to be considered and approached thoughtfully, and not just something to be consumed on the radio or on MTV. The lyrics and the themes, both musically and lyrically, faith and love and youth and optimism, but also anger and fear. I was just hooked. And I probably couldn't have articulated these thoughts back then when I was 11, 12, 13, but that was the sense that I had. And really, I'm still hooked on this album today. I don't listen to it every day, but I do go back to it regularly. And it certainly has some nostalgia, but it's so much more than that. Like, I can listen to this album and find new things still. I can listen to this album and connect with things that are new to me. And, it's even bigger than all that because this album has shaped me as a music fan. It's opened doors, it's opened genres to me. It helped me with developing a philosophy of music. And now, with it being the 30th anniversary of its release, I'm thinking about how it's still such an important album today as it was when it first came out in 1995. And to give it a little context, this was actually their third album after Gish in 1991 and Siamese Dream in 1993. And Siamese Dream was a pretty successful album in its own right on the backs of singles like Disarm and Today. But when they were getting ready to go into the studio to write and record what would end up being their third album, they realized they wanted to do something bigger, something more grand and more ambitious, something to set them apart from their peers. They wanted to rise above what popular rock music was at the time. And in order to do that, they knew they needed to be grand and ambitious in their writing, because this was during the waning age of grunge. And even though they were never a grunge band, they wanted to do something to cement their own legacy. Billy Corgan, the primary songwriter for the band, has said that they had enough music for Siamese Dream to have made that a double album, but were talked out of it. But now going into this new one, they were going to go for it. And they really did. By the time they were done with the initial writing and recording phase, they had recorded over 50 songs, which then had to be cut down to the 28 that would make the final track listing. And when it was released in October of 1995, it debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200 chart and sold over 250,000 copies in its first week. It was noted for its sweeping range of influences from grunge to alt rock to metal and shoegaze and art rock, in all of the ways that that set it apart. It went on to be nominated for 7 Grammys. It was among the top albums of the year on pretty much every year-end list. It ended up being highly rated on most end-of-decade lists. And then in 2003, Rolling Stone magazine included it in its original list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. To this day, it's sold more than 5 million copies just in the United States, with millions more being sold around the world. This album was huge. Lyrically and thematically, Billy Corgan has said that he kind of aimed this music at like an adolescent to young adult audience, and that his goal was to sum up all of the things I felt as a youth but was never able to voice articulately. I'm waving goodbye to me in the rearview mirror, tying a knot around my youth and putting it under the bed. And he did this through an exploration of themes that this audience feels, that this audience knows, things like anger and beauty and nostalgia and melancholy, but also contradicting those things with love and determination and hope. And this, I think, is where I connected with it. Even being on the younger end of that demographic when it first came out, I could relate to these things as I was moving through my teenage years. And it was always an album that I came back to and found comfort in as that confused, angry, forlorn teenager realizing that my childhood was ending. I was eager for love and I was hopeful, but kind of angry about it. And I was determined to see the future and hoped that there could be a positive future for me. But in the moment, things weren't always good or easy. And I think these themes were reinforced by this being a double album, right? So the 2 discs, there wasn't really a concept. It wasn't a concept album, but each disc kind of had its own theme, where the first disc was kind of daytime and the second disc was kind of nighttime. And I always thought that this album was about not really contradiction, but juxtaposition, right? So day doesn't contradict night, and sadness doesn't contradict love, but they invite comparison between each other. They make you consider and appreciate their opposite. And I think that's what this album ultimately is all about. And 2 of my tracks on disc 1 that highlight this juxtaposition are Jelly Belly and Muzzle, where Jelly Belly just starts with this onslaught of noise that's kind of hard to track, but eventually it resolves into this really tight riff-based kind of alt metal song with the angry lyrics to match. Things like "Living makes me sick, so sick I wish I'd die." This song just rushes forward like it's on a mission and crescendos into this very signature Billy Corgan guitar solo. And its counterpart to me is towards the end of the disc in the track Muzzle, which was probably the song that I first really connected with on this album. It starts with Corgan belting out, "I fear that I'm ordinary just like everyone." And throughout the song, he acknowledges that life isn't all sunshine and roses, but it is worth it overall. My life has been extraordinary, blessed and cursed in one. And all things most surely have to end, and great loves will one day have to part, but I know that I was meant for this world. It's not a contradiction, it's a juxtaposition to Jelly Belly. And then on the second disc, the song 33 kind of slows things down a bit. It's a bit more stripped down, acoustic based, but still very layered. It's a more reflective song, lamenting the idea of maybe not seizing the moment when you should have, and a desire to face life head on. It's a little more hopeful because he talks about how he believes love can last forever, even though just before that, in the song Bodies, he sings about love is suicide. And compare that to the song XYU towards the end of the disc, which is just a 7-minute ride that is a descent into madness. It feels heavy, it's pummeling, and it peaks with this epic scream that you just feel in your bones. And musically, this album just gives you so much to listen to. The first thing I remember noticing is the drummer, Jimmy Chamberlain. He was just so different from everything else that I had listened to before. He was so much more than just the guy keeping the beat. He was an integral part to the sound of this album, and he was so precise and so technical. And I'm not even a drummer, but that really took me. And now I know how heavily influenced he was by jazz, and you could certainly hear that. This was also the first time that I realized that I could listen for a specific instrument within a song. I could kind of tune out the rest of what was going on and focus in on one thing and learn to appreciate that one thing. Beyond the drums, the guitars on this album are just crazy. I mean, you can tell a Smashing Pumpkins song from Billy Corgan's voice. Very distinct, very unique voice. But I think you can also tell a Smashing Pumpkins song just by the guitars. They are immediately identifiable. They have a tone. They have a feel. Between Billy Corgan's just soaring, fuzzy, noisy solos to James Iha's ability to build layers of guitar sounds to make the tracks just feel dense and pleasing to listen to, this album really inspired me to want to pick up the guitar. And then the songwriting, again, it's just so different. I feel like I'm saying this a million times, but it's just so different from anything else that I had ever listened to before. They weren't afraid to play with the structure of a song. They weren't confined to a conventional song form. They had songs without obvious choruses or hooks, songs with movement and life. They had songs that weren't just 3.5 minutes of verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus. They had songs that were 9 minutes long, and all of this opened my eyes to a world where songs could be more than just what you hear on the radio. And I think, in my estimation, these songs were the apex of 90s rock songwriting. It was sincere, it was honest and genuine, and it was authentic. So now we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of this album, and the big question is, does it hold up? And for me, it absolutely does. I think the themes of this album, both musically and lyrically, are universal. They're relatable just as much today as they were to teenagers in the 90s. This album doesn't feel old. It doesn't feel dated. It still feels relevant. That's a huge deal. This really is an album that I come back to regularly. Maybe not every day, but very regularly. And I could name a dozen albums that at various times in my life I've absolutely loved. But I don't go back to those albums the way I do with this one. And even within the Smashing Pumpkins, I don't go back to the Pumpkins themselves very much. I liked Gish. Siamese Dream was really good. Later on, Adore and Machina were fine. But this album, nothing comes anywhere close to Mellon Collie for me. I think at this point it's safe to say that I won't be outgrowing this album. It was the first album to change my life. It changed the way I listen to music. It changed what music means to me. It changed what I look for and what I connect with in music. And I don't expect that everyone has had the same feelings about this particular album, but I would love to hear what album you do have that makes you feel this way. What album you have that you connect to like this. Maybe it is this one, but it was probably something else. So really, let me know in the comments. I really am interested because I'd like to listen to as many of those albums as I can find that other people connect with the way I connect with Mellon Collie and the Infinite Sadness. So tell me down there, what's an album you connect with? Tell me a story about that album. Don't forget to subscribe for more music discussions. And until next time, I'm Kyle, and I've got some music to listen to.